Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to talk about the Arab world and America. But before they do that, I want to remind you of something from last time. Last time was the Russians and Russian-American relations. The reasons the Russians were here along the coast of California was that they were trading all the way from Alaska down through British Columbia, down through the Northwest with the local Indians. It was the fur trade for Russian nobility, who lived in a very cold climate. Nice warm furs were always wanted. And so the Russian fur trades extended all the way down to our coast. And there were very famous markers for this. For instance, there's a river I know very well to our north. It's the Russian River. It's now a sort of a playground for people in the various towns up and down the river. But in its day, it took its name from the Russian fur traders that introduced their trade skills to the local Indians. Now enough, and one other thing about the Russians, they also had some influence in San Francisco in the old days. If you go down Geary Boulevard towards the ocean, you get out to the outer avenues, you will see on your right as you go to the ocean, a large Orthodox church with onion domes. And in that, there is also a rather famous stretch of restaurants where you can buy Russian food that's really quite wonderful. So if you're out in that part of the avenues, do stop in at one of those small Russian to-go places and go with them. And now, I don't know what that thing is doing up there. It says it's a COVID screening test, but I assume the rest of us are okay because we've all had our shots. So now we want to start with the Arab world and America. Initially, we were not part of that large Arab world. Let me go to the time when there was this huge release of energy, and out of the Arabian desert came the energizing force of Islam, and Islam moved rapidly across all the nearby territories. It was not necessarily a religion that was looking for converts. You could live in Islamic society in the old days and be Christian, be Jewish, and live in peace with your ruling neighbors. Or you could convert to Islam, which many people did do. So what we have is a time in which this energy released itself in the form of huge, it's like a blitzkrieg, it's in the German sense. It was an Arab army, all mounted on these fast-moving Arab steeds. So they would appear on the horizon and then be in your territory before you could do anything about it. So this is in the 7th century. And as this proceeds, Arab armies move out of Arabia, and first they move into Syria, where a leader who becomes the caliph and is from a family, the Umayyads, sets up the first of these kingdoms, if you wish. But then the caliph among the Umayyads, he died, and the family died out, and a new family replaced, and they moved to the magnificent city of Baghdad. So it's in Baghdad with the Abbasid dynasty that we have some former knowledge, because what this magnificent group of people are doing is they're like a vacuum cleaner. They're vacuuming up the culture that was there before them and using it so that all that was glorious about Greece and Rome is now sucked up in this vacuum cleaner and becomes part of the Arab world. And it's that Arab world that then later, you call it the Renaissance. The Italians just don't walk around picking things up. They don't find a manuscript here and there. Manuscripts don't last that long. What they do is they find Arab translations of the great works of Plato and Aristotle, the great plays of I can't pronounce his name now, the great epics like the Iliad and Homer's other work, Ulysses. So you get this, shall we say, saving grace that comes via the Arab world. Now, let us turn to some particular topics. In the days of the Abbasid Caliphate in the marvelous city of Baghdad, which exists between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, you have a famous caliph, Harun al-Rashid. And it comes to Harun al-Rashid's attention that somewhere in the far west, beyond his borders, is a native people who are going to go to this small town called Rome. Now, you remember in the height of the Roman Empire, Rome had a population of 1 million plus. By the time of the decline, they had gone down to 60,000, and they'd lost most of their internal knowledge about fixing aqueducts. So no one fixed them. The waters didn't run. It was a bad time, the dark, dark, darkest of ages. But nevertheless, there was going to be some ceremony in this western part beyond his kingdom, that is, beyond the caliph's kingdom. And in that, they would be taking a chieftain or some kind of chief and giving him some kind of crown. Of course, what this is, we have a history of it, is the fact that Charlemagne, Charles the Great, is going to Rome to have himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And he does, he comes to Rome and has the Pope crown him. So it is that the Caliph in Baghdad wants to send a present. So he sends a beautifully handmade golden clock. There's one problem. Charlemagne does not read or write. The nobles with him do not read or write. The only people who can read and write are the monks that happen to be traveling with him or coming from the great abbeys, like the abbey along the road coming down to Rome from northern Italy. So there's a problem. The people around Charlemagne know it's wintertime when the sun rises late and sets early. And they know it's summertime when the sun rises even earlier and sets even later. And in other words, they just know the seasons by the nature of looking around them and seeing nature at work. Whereas the Arabs, who have been so inventive, they've given us not only our numbers, you know that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are Arabic numerals given to us by the Arab world. Just think how difficult it would be to balance your checkbook in Roman numerals. So they not only gave us that, they gave us algebra, they gave us the study of the stars, all the various things that were advanced in nature were advanced by the Arabs initially. So it was that you have this phenomenon of Harun al-Rashid trying to recognize a foreign prince who is in fact stupid, who's not literate. It's not only illiterate, he's not numerate. Neither can he work with numbers or with letters. So much for Charlemagne. Now this empire that grew, we won't go on and on about how it grew towards Iran and then towards India and all the way to Indonesia. But we will talk about its growth towards the West. It spread rapidly across North Africa, today which you call Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and then into Spain. And it left behind a great civilization. Now, the civilization that came into Spain came there and lasted 800 years, which is a fairly long time, longer than we've existed as a nation. And we get a name from this time. This area of Spain was where the sun set. As far as they were concerned in the west, you came across the strait there of Gibraltar. It was a mountain on one side and a mountain on the other. And the Greeks knew that before the Abbasid dynasty existed. The Greeks called these the Pillars of Hercules. And beyond that, no one knew what existed. Maybe you fell off the side if you believed the earth was flat. Nevertheless, the Arabs crossed that area and settled for 800 years in Andalus, the land of the setting sun. Now the Spaniards call it Andalusia, but once it was Andalus, and the great cities there were particularly Cordoba, which had an enormous library, and certainly Granada, the city of the Alhambra, a magnificent palace complex that's still there to be seen today. And the Arabs continued their move. They moved up the coast, the Mediterranean coast, and founded other cities like Valencia, and kept moving, and moved and came to the mountains you call the Pyrenees, and they crossed the Pyrenees near the coast and went all the way to a place in France where they met up with a guy named Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, and he defeated them. So they withdrew beyond the Pyrenees and put down their roots there in what would be Arab Spain, where they stayed for 800 years. They only left with their final defeat. And in that period of time, a great epic poem was created in Spain. That epic, of course, is El Cid. And El Cid was made into a swashbuckling movie. Not very truthful, but nevertheless, there was Charlton Heston on a horse. And he was El Cid, and he was in love with a beautiful woman played by Sophia Loren. And so we have this sort of funny version of the epic poem. The French have an epic poem from that period also. It comes from the story of the defeat of the Arab power in France, the Song of Roland. So it is that you have this Spanish world. And one of the things to be noted, while we in the West, that's you and I, our grandparents and great-grandparents, and on to the back, hardly could read and write. In Cordoba, you could come to an area in which there was a library with over 60,000 volumes. Now, if you can remember that there is no library to speak of in the Western world, nothing in Paris, nothing in Rome, nothing up on the German border, nothing over in Roman Britain that even can compare to the one library that is in Cordoba. Cordoba also has the most magnificent mosque you'll ever see, with teeny weeny, thin pillars holding up this vast amount of space, both underground and above ground. Now, when the Spanish finally got their act together, and when Ferdinand and Isabella, having married and forced the reconquest onto Spain, they came down to Cordoba and conquered it. They also then conquered the last Arab citadel, which was in Granada. But I want to tell you the story about the great mosque in Cordoba. Once Cordoba had been conquered, the Spanish decided it would be nice to build a church on top of it. So they did. Built this enormous Catholic church where, in fact, still stood the base of this great mosque. And it was interesting because Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, who was going to inherit the Spanish world, Spanish and Portuguese world, both in the New World and here, and also in the Austrian and Hungarian areas of the Habsburgs. And when he saw what they had done and knew what had been here and what was still there as the base, he said prophetically, "You have taken something beautiful," meaning the mosque, "and ruined it with this claptrap thing that you call a Christian church on top of it." So at least one of the new Habsburg rulers of Spain knew of the glories that had been there for 800 years, longer than we've existed as a nation. So it was that slowly but surely things changed. And you might say to me, well, you told me this was going to be about the American Arab, but in fact, there are no Americans around, and that you're right. The Americans are going to come. It seems that nothing's happened until Jefferson was president. Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. Jefferson gave us his own library, which is the Library of Congress. Jefferson this, Jefferson that. Jefferson also gave us a famous document, the Declaration of Independence. And when he was finished with his 8 years, Jefferson rode a horse all the way from the White House back to Charlottesville to his home. A very different country in those days, very robust. I don't think that most of us could even walk the distance it would take all day just to drive the distance between the White House and Monticello. So it was, Jefferson had a problem. And the problems came about because there were these Barbary pirates. They used to call San Francisco's North Beach the Barbary Coast. You could get shanghaied from there if you were lucky. But in this case, the Barbary Coast was loaded down with pirates. And they wouldn't want to catch Americans per se. They wanted to catch anybody who could pay a ransom to get that guy or that gal free. The greatest novel in the Western world, first of the greats, was Don Quixote, as the French call him. And Don Quixote was written by Cervantes. And Cervantes was taken as a prisoner by the Barbary pirates. But now the Barbary pirates were catching some Americans and they were wanting ransoms. And Jefferson didn't like this at all. So he sent an American military group to defeat the Barbary pirates. And they operated out of a little bit on the Moroccan side, but mainly out of Algeria and Libya. So you have a very famous song. It's sung by a bunch of guys who are usually a little drunk, all US Marines. And it goes something like, "From the halls of Montezuma," which means our interference in Mexico, to the shores of Tripoli. And the Tripoli they're referring to is our intervention using US Marines to put an end to this pirate raiding group on the Barbary Coast. Now, we continue to have a kind of relationship, but it was limited because the French, always looking for empires, built a second empire, the Second Empire of Louis Napoleon. This is Napoleon's third. And they built that empire starting in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Libya went to the Italians, and Egypt, crown jewel, was split between French culture, most of the Egyptian higher class spoke French, and British money. The French had built the Suez Canal, and the British Prime Minister Disraeli had bought the shares on the French bourse. So Britain owned the canal that the French had built. And so they had a condominium over Egypt. And that comprised North Africa. So much of North Africa was in the hands of the French. And so when anything went wrong or anything went awry, you always had to go through Paris first to find out what was going on in Algiers or in other places. And you found that a large number of French people love this part of the country. Even today, many famous French movie stars, Alain Delon, Brigitte Bardot, they live in Morocco, even though Morocco is independent. They live on the coast of Morocco, on the Grand Corniche, they call it, way in the south of Morocco. And in the case of all those French who used to live in Algeria, many of them left, returned to France, and became part of a very ugly scene for a while they tried to show some resistance to Charles de Gaulle and his attempts to rid himself of this foolish empire to begin with. It wasn't paying its way. And so it was that there was a bad time. To show you how bad that time was and how stupid we were, there was an Italian named Portacovo, and he made a brilliant film called The Battle of Algiers, which shows you the French trying to hold on to Algeria in the worst possible way, torture and other things, and not actually being able to do so, no matter what they did. The Algerians were determined to be free. And so it was that they gained their freedom, and many of the French then left and went back to France. Not all of them. And in many cases, some of the greatest writers in the French language came from French Algeria. I'm thinking about Albert Camus. Camus was born in Algeria, I believe in the city of Constantine, which is now called Mirs el-Kabir. But he, being from Algeria, when he won his great prize for his many wonderful books, he was greeted by Jean-Paul Sartre with a nasty comment that he wasn't bad as Algerian poets went. Or in fact, his works are works of great genius. One in particular, No Exit, which is a play he wrote, or was involved with the process because there were three of them: Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, and then Albert Camus. I spent time there in Algeria. There was two friends of mine, Diane and Bruce Rogers, were assigned there from the State Department. So they invited me to come over, and I rushed right over. You know, often get invitations like that. And I used their home there to be able to take a visit out to Tunisia. And what I wanted to see in Tunisia was the resort city along the coast, and I got to see that. And more importantly, Bruce loaned me his secretary, and she drove the car. And we went out to a desert city, Gadaia. And there, as usual, the secretary, as usual, had forgot to check the gas. So there we are in the Sahara Desert, and we run out of gas, which makes me less than happy. But I'm a very lucky guy because I'm carrying with me, in case I should run out, I smoked in those days, and so I have a carton of Marlboro cigarettes. And so she and I get out on the road and we thumb down a big truck of Algerian people going somewhere, I guess, but they were going on our road. And we begged from them some gasoline. And so they were very nice people, and they gave us enough to fill up and to get back to Algiers. So in return, as a present, I gave them this carton of cigarettes, which they thought was gold itself. So there we were with our carton of cigarettes, passing it off to the Algerians and finally getting to Kodaya, which is this amazing city out in the desert. Unbelievable that a group of, there are various branches of Islam. The two big ones are Sunni, and basically we know Sunni Islam from our people here. We have a number of wonderful people working at Piedmont Gardens who come from Algeria. Rosa in the dining room from Algeria. Anis, when he used to be here, he was from Algeria. And we have other people who are also from the Arab world in one way or the other, having come over to sunny California, where it's cold right now, and making a living here by working at Piedmont Gardens. And it's wonderful to have them here. Now, when Bruce and Diane invited me, I went joyfully, only to discover that Bruce and Diane had two ankle biters living with them. They'd had children, Scott and Laura. And so I spent my time, when I had free time, making their lives miserable. Scott had saved a stick of gum. You'd be surprised how precious that stick of gum was. And I chewed it all up, which then just destroyed him. He couldn't get over the fact that I had chewed up his one last remaining stick of gum, and he wouldn't see gum again until he moved back to the United States. And with Laura, I did many things to upset her also, short sheeting her bed and all the rest of the things that you can do to make children unhappy. They also got even by putting ice cubes in my shoes and other little things you can do when you're totally bored sitting up on the hills. But we were staying in a villa. I think it was a Villa Viviani. But anyway, I went walking down into the Kasbah. The Kasbah is the Arab section of the city. And it's washed down every day by the French who go to the top of this huge cliff-like where some 700,000 Arabs live. And they wash it down with these big hoses every day. And then I would go down there because I wanted to go to the place where Hedy Lamarr had said to Charles Boyer, "Take me to the Kasbah." And the film is still one of my favorites, even though I think of Hedy Lamarr in many different ways. We're soon going to see her here as Delilah in Samson and Delilah. But she became famous in Austria. She was a Jewish lady who had been in a film, and she swam on the Danube in her birthday suit, which I thought was exciting. And then she ran along the banks of the Danube in her birthday suit. And this caused the big shots at MGM to hire her. And she came off to make films in Hollywood. And then it had a very sad ending to her life. She did develop a code that she had the copyright to, and the defense establishment paid her money for that copyright because they used it during the war. But then she moved to Florida. Major mistake. Don't move to Florida and don't move to Texas. And she moved to Florida, and then she was caught. Unfortunately, how should I put it? She was shoplifting makeup. And so it was a sad end to Hedy Lamarr, who had been Delilah in Samson and Delilah, and many other films, as well as the one she made when she was in Europe. So I got to go down to see where Hedy Lamarr, of course, she didn't come to Algeria to say it, but in the film, Algiers, she always said to Charles Boyer, "Take me to the Kasbah." And so it is that there were a lot of films that were made about subjects that were Arab. I think of a wonderful film about T.E. Lawrence, the guy who helped the Arabs. He wasn't American, he was British. He was paid by a wonderful guy, Peter O'Toole, who's very much Irish. And it's a glorious film trying to show how we, now realizing that the Arab world had been overrun by the Turkish world, and the Turks had their foot on the throat of the Arabs, and Lawrence was going to help release them. And he did, in fact. And the film is a glorious piece of filmmaking, again with Peter O'Toole, which we will get a chance to see here when we put it on our schedule of films to be seen, since we show a film every night. So you have not only just those aspects, you have another aspect that is very demeaning, and how to tell this story. The story is told basically through classical music. There is, in the Russian tradition, the Russians have part of the Arab world in their world, in the Caucasus. And people like the great playwright Tolstoy, not just playwright, but also great novelist, had visited there and written about it. And so the Russians decided to compose music that would somehow express, I don't know what that noise is, but we will go on anyway. We have the Russian connection, which then comes over to America because Americans love this music. And you hear it first, maybe foremost, in Prince Igor, which was an opera that's not seen often here, but we played it once in San Francisco. It's quite marvelous. And it's by Borodin. And then suddenly all this Russian music comes pouring in. We have Scheherazade, both as a story, but then as a piece of music, Prince Igor. And then we have a famous Broadway musical, Kismet, where all of this music is suddenly brought into popular form because the music is very singable. So in the case of Kismet, you have a number of famous tunes that cross over into American Broadway singing actors and actresses trying to celebrate part of what was Borodin's music. Of course, they've jazzed it up and made it very sellable on Broadway. So we have this music, be it Scheherazade, be it Prince Igor, or the musical Kismet, all mixing and giving us a view. But what is happening to this is a very unfortunate case. And that case is brought to our attention by a wonderful man who taught at Columbia. His name was Edward Said. Said was a Palestinian Arab. And as such, he gave us an explanation of what we had done in the West. He called it Orientalism, that we had made of the Arab world a very exotic other. And we had done this by distorting their history. And we did it in our popular culture. One of the great films of silent era had an Argentinian-born actor playing the Sheik. And this, of course, is Rudolph Valentino. And he was certainly famous. And when he died quite early, his funeral was famous. And then there was a woman for decades who came every year of his death and put a rose on his gravesite down in Hollywood. Rudolph Valentino and the Sheik. Now, you wouldn't want to see that movie today. It's the silly aspect of the Arab Sheik goes to an oasis, and then at the oasis, he brings his woman to be there and be with him. And so this is what you begin to see of a civilization that had built this great city of Baghdad, was now nothing but a bunch of guys riding a fast steed, swooping down and picking up a gorgeous woman who usually is only half dressed. And then she's swirling around the oasis, dancing and picking figs and other things for him to eat. Well, instead, I don't know how many of you, I know quite a few of you are my Jewish friends, and you might have been to Jerusalem. But the most beautiful building in all of Jerusalem, in all of that part of the world, is called the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is not a Jewish or Christian, but in fact built by Arabs, is an Arab view of their religion turned into a stone monument. It's absolutely gorgeous. You can see the dome, the gold-covered dome for miles. And as a piece of architecture, it cannot be outdone, which is something that will tell you that there's something wrong in American culture if, in fact, the only way we can visualize this fabulous former civilization, the civilization that stretched all the way from Spain across North Africa, all the way across the Middle East, up into Russia, Ruslan, as the Germans would call it, and then all the way across Asia, all the way into India. And in those days, India was, in fact, Muslim. You know that, I know we'll come to it later when we do Iran, but the Taj Mahal, which you can hardly see today because it's so badly polluted with the burning of the grass and the other items on the Ganges plain that I've gone up to it and I had to get within a foot before I could even see it. And then I had to feel it with my hands. It's a marvelous piece of Persian architecture. It's not Hindu Indian, and it's certainly not British. It extends all the way out to South Asia, this wonderful culture that offered the world algebra. You must remember algebra. A is 2 and B is 3. A plus B must be 5. That's the simplest way I can give you an algebraic equation. But algebra could have been used, as could trigonometry, by the Arabs long before we were over there with Charlemagne counting rocks. It was a great civilization, and Edward Said was correct in suggesting that we had, in Orientalism, made something different than what was. Now, Said was very good at understanding he could cross over. So he crossed over from one side, the Islamic side, to the Israeli side. And there was a famous composer and conductor who was Jewish, wasn't Leonard Bernstein. And this man connected with Said, and so they would cross the forbidden line. They would together, the composer would invite Said over to teach at the University of Jerusalem. And then Said would invite the Jewish composer over to the other side, the Arab side Greater Palestine, if you wish. And he would then play his music to the students. They were trying to build a bridge of peace, and tried to get away from all the claptrap that had gone into the hatred and the dislike. You know that there's a history of Jewish Muslim relations that are very, very good in that great city that was Cordoba and Granada and Sevilla. 800 years, Jews lived there with the Arab rulers, and they were highly respected. A very famous doctor was sent for, and he left Arab Spain and crossed all of Arab North Africa to come into Cairo to treat a rather famous Arab patient. How all this could be done was simply that they had tolerated each other and had lived at peace with each other. And not only in that case, but in a later case, they also lived at peace with the Turks, who are to come as a traveling group of wandering tribal people out of Central Asia into Anatolia, or as you call it, Turkey today. So it was that later enmity, later dislike, is part of the modern world, not part of the old world. The old world had, in fact, if you look closely at the chronicles of the Crusaders were despised both by the Arabs and by the Jews because they killed both groups when they came supposedly to the, quote, Holy Land, end quote, to find the place where Jesus had lived, where he had worked, where he had done his miracles, to find the place where he had been crucified. When they did this, in the process, they killed as many Jews and many Arabs as they could. So the Crusades were never looked on as a holy event by the people of the Arab world or the people of the Jewish world. And there are cases of this drifted through our world, even at Berkeley. We had a wonderful professor of Middle East studies. We had several, in fact. Ira Lapidus was one. He was Jewish, and he wrote a wonderful book on the 3 Islamic cities, Cairo, Jerusalem, and Damascus. And we had a wonderful guy in my department, Ibrahim Wardeh. And Ibrahim now teaches at Tufts University, Fletcher School. But he was with us at Berkeley and wrote a wonderful dissertation, and we see him often in print in a wonderful French journal, Le Monde Diplomatique. And Le Monde Diplomatique is a famous work in French, although there is an English version of it, in which you can get a view different than ours. And in that sense, I get that quite often from a friend of mine in Paris who's at Sciences Po. You have to understand the French have all their own system as usual, and they have these grandes écoles. And my friend Yves teaches at a grande école in Paris, Sciences Po. And he's made a great impression on me when he came to Berkeley to teach for us. He came also with 2 of my favorite people, Ilter and Guru Turan from Istanbul. So Berkeley's had these many long connections to this world. And the professor that made all this possible for us was a Polish guy. He had come to Berkeley in a very odd way. He'd gotten his PhD at Lille in northern France, but he had escaped the Nazis pushing into Poland and had walked all the way, get a load of this, you think Jefferson did it on horseback. This guy did it on footback all the way through Jerusalem and across the Jordan River and all the way to Iran. Because there was a Polish army in exile, and it was also down there. And so now this man, with the great courage that he had, was going to join that army and fight the Nazis all the way back to Berlin. And first, he joined up with the British units that were in, because Britain had taken over to make sure that the Nazis never crossed into Cairo and cut the canal, the lifeblood to India. So it was that we have this group of British and Polish units, and they do all kinds of good things. Say, for instance, when it's time to take back part of North Africa from the Nazis, this Polish group lands at Tobruk, a famous site on the North African coast. And so you have, this amazing complex situation of Berkeley faculty who had fought in the war. We had Gunther Barth was a great professor, and he had been caught up in his youth, in the Nazi youth, and had fought in the German army in Italy. And he was a wonderful guy and a wonderful teacher. And so all over the campus, you could find these people who had dedicated themselves to learning and to being part of the greater world and to try and explain that world to Americans who never knew anything about it. I'll give you an example. Once the people, I think Jackie Olson was in charge then of Cal Travel. It was a group that took Cal alumni on trips. And this trip was going to go to, of all places, Libya. And it was a place I had never been. I'd been to Morocco, I'd been to Algeria, I'd been to Tunisia, but never to Libya. So I was anxious to go. So we flew over first to a little island off the coast of Greece. It's known as Crete. And there, waiting for us in the harbor at Heraklion, was a beautiful, beautiful ocean-going yacht, which took 40 passengers and a very large crew. And after touring around Crete, which has a wonderful history of its own, we then got on the ship and we sailed across the Mediterranean to Libya. Now, Libya is a very strange country. Number one, it's 98% desert. So there is a little strip of land along the coast that's green. Otherwise, forget it. But it has the ruins of one of the most famous Roman emperors who came from Libya. And the ruins are at Lepus Magna. And so we went there, of course, took lots of pictures of me climbing on altars and up near statues, because the Arab world does not care very much for its Roman past. They were not part of it, so they don't preserve it. That time I was with Bruce and Diane in Algeria. We went out to a famous Roman seaside resort, Tipasa, and they didn't do anything with it. You could pull the sand back from the ground, from the sandy beach, and there underneath was a wonderful Roman mosaic that they had just left to be covered by the sands of time, along with their famous writer, Albert Camus, who used to come to Tipasa also, like me. And that's why I wanted to go there and stand where Camus had stood. And so now we're in Libya, and I'm in Lapis Magna, and I'm in Second Heaven. Now, it's a very different place, we don't have very good relations with them. My friend Ibrahim Modeh was due to lead this trip, and the Libyans found out he'd written a very unfortunate article on Gaddafi, and so that was the end of his invitation. That is Ibrahim's. But we were living and surviving there. And every day we went back to our ship and went off the 3-mile limit. We were like 3 miles and 1 inch offshore. And of course, this is because you can't keep the Americans away from their evening martini. So we were out there in the middle of the Mediterranean, looking back at the shore, drinking our scotch and waters, our scotch and sodas, our gin and tonics, in bliss, because the Libyans would not do anything to us. And when we came ashore, even to make sure they weren't angry with us, we would lock all the liquor up in the cabinets down below and make sure that they did not see any residue when they came on board, to lead us onto a small ship that was taking us to this desert kingdom. And of course, the story of Gaddafi goes on forever. He was a true Arab. When he came to Paris, he cast his tent near the Élysée Palace, the French president's home, and he slept outside in the tent. This is really being an Arab. And so you had this unfortunate experience in the fact that while we applauded de Gaulle, and de Gaulle giving the Arabs their freedom, Ben Bella, Boudamine, these people from Algeria who are going to be now the leaders of the new Algeria, and of course the man who has been the godfather and grandfather of Tunisia, he was given a free ride into freedom. And the Moroccans remained very loyal to the French, even though they took freedom also. And many Moroccans, who was running that machine, making that noise. Anyway, many Moroccans still write in French and publish in French and win many awards for their novels and their plays, like the Prix Goncourt, which is a very famous award you can win if you're good enough to do so. But of course, life went on. And then a cowboy, you know, the current president we have is Irish. He has a very subtle sense of humor. And he's now referring to his predecessor as that guy, which I think is wonderful. It's a wonderful way to forget the name that's cursed by many. And so it is that Ronald Reagan became president of the United States. No one knows how. This state of California is unbelievable. We elect somebody governor. He didn't get to be president only because he wasn't born here. Known as Schwarzenegger, a bodybuilder, a weightlifter, a Sacramento leader of the least order. And so now we have Reagan as president. And you know, it's funny, you shouldn't talk out loud on any system that can be spied on, because the systems will tell the story in spades. And so it was one very bleak night in Berlin. They're often bleak, particularly after Marlene Dietrich left town. And you have an explosion that takes place in a bar frequented by American soldiers. We kept in those days the Berlin Brigade, which had 6,000 American troops in it. And that was our tripwire. We knew they could be overrun by the Soviets, who kept 200,000 Red Army troops surrounding Berlin. But we knew that they knew that we knew that they knew that if they overran and killed our people in Berlin, it would be a cause belli. The next thing you would know is that nuclear weapons were being dropped on the Soviet Union. So they never overran our positions in Berlin. But somebody had put a bomb, and it wasn't the KGB. It wasn't the GRU, the military intelligence. It was Gaddafi and his group of thugs. Now, how do we know that's so? Well, we know it's so because the guys who made the plan called the guys in Berlin and told them all about it and where the weapons were and where the escape route and spelled out everything in spades, in the clear, no less. Well, we have this funny building. It's over at Fort Meade, Maryland. It's called the National Security Agency. It was built when Truman decided to have the National Security Act passed of 1947, and it included an NSA. All they do is listen to any kind of broadcast anywhere in the world, and they do it by wideband. So they pick this stuff up, and then analysts go through and see if they're getting anything but junk, and 98% of it is junk. Some radio station in Bulgaria is sending out Bulgarian good wishes to nobody. But in all this junk is the message from the agent handler back in Libya, telling the Libyan agents where to find the Americans drinking and how to blow them up. And so when the Dernza, as he's called, the director of national intelligence, went from Fort Meade to the White House to confront the cowboy on the horse, better known as Ronnie Reagan, he had less than patience. And so now it was obvious that the Americans had been killed by Libyans. And this man in the White House was not going to stand for that. So he called a woman at number 10 Downing Street. She was known as the Iron Lady. She was a piece of work herself. She was a Tory, soon to be thrown out of office, but that's another story. And he says to Margaret Thatcher, I want you to join me in an effort to teach this guy a lesson. I plan to send a raiding force of aircraft, high performance jets, and I plan to use your aerodromes, your air spaces where your Air Force trains, and I ask you to join me. She says, immediately, I'm with you. So now the problem is, if you know where England's located, and you know where France is located, you know where Libya, you have to fly over France to get to Libya on the direct route. And Ronald Reagan had his ambassador ask for passage, free passage. And Mitterrand was the head of the French government, and Mitterrand said, no, no, no. So now you have two Anglo-Saxon nations furious at the French and determined to do it anyway. So they flew, but they flew the border between Spain and France, the Pyrenees, staying always on the Spanish line, and then down to Libya, and then they bombed the hell out of Gaddafi's palace. Unfortunately, Gaddafi wasn't there, so all they did was kill Gaddafi's daughter. But Gaddafi certainly got the message, and that was the last time he bothered to bomb any American anywhere in the world. But there we had been again on the wrong side of the long haul, because of course Gaddafi is gone. We were happy when he was overthrown by his own people. The French and the British colluded in that killing of Gaddafi. And now we are stuck, because none of us ever think long range. We are an ahistorical people ourselves. We have no sense of history. And so the question was, who will take over for Gaddafi? And they've never figured that out to this very day. Libya is a total mess. It was a major, major error. Before you throw someone else out, you should know who you're throwing in. And if what you can't find is going to be worse than what you've got to learn to live with what you got. So it is that Gaddafi is gone. No one's bombing anyone in Berlin in their little wine stubas or their beer halls. And so it is that life goes on and the Arab world goes on. But in many ways, the Arabs don't trust us. They don't think we do know anything about their rich and powerful and wonderful history. And they don't think we appreciate it. All they see are people like me stealing gum from a kid named Scott Rogers. And they don't see the larger picture. And so it's quite unfortunate that you have that. You have a different attitude coming from my friend like Yves. Yves teaches not only at the Sciences Po, not only at his home university, which he has taught at Aix-en-Provence, but he teaches at an Arab university in the Arab part of Transjordan, as it's unfortunately called today. He does a wonderful job. He loves what he does. He loves that he is trying to help people who need help. So anyway, it's a long and painful story. And we're going to go through it because it's only one part of the story. We will have America and the Turkish Empire, Suleiman the Magnificent, the great, wonderful guy who took over for the Turks when they lost in World War I and made them a secular state, the best thing that ever happened to them. But once upon a time, the Turks were at the gates of Vienna and had all of the lower Danube under their control. They had a horrible institution where they took up Serbian children, males, and made them part of a special guard for the Sultan's harem. But that's another story at another time. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please come back and join us the next time for American relations with the Turks, going way back to before we were and before any of us had a connection to these wonderful people who live in Istanbul and are governed from Ankara. Thank you.